Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Darshan Talks. My name is Darshan Kulkarni, and I'm glad to have you. As you know, it's my mission to help patients trust the products they depend on. I'm an attorney, I'm a pharmacist, and I advise companies with FDA-regulated products. So if you have an interest in FDA-regulated companies or their products, this is the podcast for you. Today's podcast is going to be really interesting because we have a guest with us, what I think is fair to say a total badass. She is the the expert on digital health. She's worked in pharma. She's currently chief commercial officer at Miami, which is a direct to consumer brand and we'll talk a little bit more about it as well. But so if you are in the business of financing companies, if you're in the business of funding, if you're in the business of finding patients, if you want to work with digital health companies, this is the podcast you want to listen to. Without further ado, our guest for today, Melinda Decker. Hey, Melinda.
Hey there.
So it's really good to have you on as always. And we actually landed up meeting earlier today, and one of the things that popped out for all of us was the idea that everyone's talking about how there was suddenly a switch that turned on, and money's flowing through the system, and everyone's going, I can finally invest in my products, invest into patients. What's changed? What is the difference from, say, I don't know, a year ago?
So the group that we were meeting with, as background for folks, was actually a group of biotech, pharma, digital health, weird mix of life science folks, fantastic group of people. So we're actually talking about how biotech was on. And I actually gave the example that clearly in the past year with COVID, investment in digital health has really kicked up as well. And so clearly there's lots of investment. There's new startups and funding in biotech. But if you look at the amount of investment, especially even in the past 6 weeks in digital health, huge rounds have been closed. Companies are closing hundreds of millions. Valuations are billions of dollars on their, say, Series C, Series D in digital health. It's really amazing and impressive. And a little plug, I subscribe to Brian Dolan's Exits and Outcomes, valuable piece of information on the industry. And every Monday he releases a roundup. And for several weeks in a row, we were over $1 billion. And so we were disappointed when one of the weeks was 800 million in funding in digital health. And that's
just 1 week.
Just a week, right? And so just that kind of plug that I find interesting to say. There's so much going on, but it's broad, right? It's telemedicine, it's real world evidence generation. There's digital therapeutics companies. I mean, digital health is a huge category, but the funding, because we're trying to figure out how to do remote monitoring, collect data, improve the way clinical trials are run. There's so many different things happening, but it has opened up, and it's wonderful to see. Even the space, Hinge Health, which does digital therapeutics in the musculoskeletal, actually I would say more digital care. They do work with employers, which is how a lot of the companies that have done well recently have done, is work through self-insured employers and payers to offer this as a service. So that was just a perfect example, a $3 billion valuation. I think they've been around since something like 2014. So great to see the growth, wonderful outcomes. There's some others in the space, Kaya Health coming behind. Omada just mentioned that they're doing some work in musculoskeletal, but some really, really good things with the funding that's coming out.
So you talk about the money coming in, the funding coming in, but which direction is it going? Is it in the perspective of we're going to land up paying for more products? Is it in the perspective of we want to fund more research? Is it in the context of we'll happily pay for more? So where is that funding really being directed?
Yeah. So I think there's several different places it's going. So overall, the really, really great thing about digital health is that it's focused on improving outcomes. And a lot of improving outcomes is also through reducing costs, right? So it's actually, you pay for this, but you end up saving money, whether it's employers, payers, and you get better outcomes. It's this beautiful win-win that digital health is. And so there's different places there that the funding is. Some of the funding, for example, has been in the R&D space and speeding up clinical trials, doing clinical trial recruitment, e-consent. Some of that's saving costs, but some of that's bringing new valuable biotech treatments, for example, to patients faster, right? So again, wonderful. Someone will be paying for it, but again, improving outcomes. Some products, of course, over time have increased the cost of care, right? So you get better outcomes, but it costs you something. So it's a win with maybe a neutral. on the side for some other things. But many of the areas that people are focusing on now are truly win-wins. You save money, you get better outcomes. People are diagnosed faster. They see results faster because they're not waiting 6 weeks to get into a specialist. They can do something remote, digital, do cognitive behavioral therapy at home rather than trying to wait to get in to see a therapist, treating ADHD earlier, diagnosing it earlier, autism. There's so many things that are happening. I love what I'm doing, so I know you have to.
No, I love that you're passionate about it, and it's always been evident that you are. But let's start from the basics, because I've heard this term being thrown around, and I struggle with it because it feels like such a broad term. When you used the term digital therapeutics or digital health, that can be everything, like you said, literally from real-world evidence generation to remote monitoring to telemedicine. What are you referring to? Are you referring to all of them? Are you referring to something specific?
So digital health is a broad category. Digital therapeutics is a subset of that. So I first start with that. Digital health, I think the FDA's official definition is something around, it's technology, it involves technology and IT in order to improve outcomes, right? So it's not like IT infrastructure type of things, but very looking at improving outcomes. So that's, I'll just say digital health broadly. Digital therapeutics are generally prescription digital therapeutics in particular are looked at as treatments. And so they're FDA regulated as medical devices. And so some of the examples are Click Therapeutics has a product for smoking cessation. Pear Therapeutics has one for substance and opioid abuse disorder. So they're very, very specific. They have a clearance from the FDA to be used. They have a level of evidence that is there. And if you need more information, the Digital Therapeutics Alliance has a great definition on what digital therapeutics are. But I would say a lot of things are in like an adjacent space, like digital care. Sometimes things are used to improve symptoms rather than treat the condition, so improve symptoms of disease. Some things have human element. My own company, we are a combination of an app. So MyMe works in autoimmune disease and to identify triggers. And it's an app plus health coaches. And so I say there's a human element. It's not all just purely digital. It's not, just taking pictures of your food or recording symptoms. There's humans who help with behavior change, identifying, figuring out the algorithms to, and data analytics to identify your triggers. So that's kind of adjacent areas. There's some great graphics out there. I just did a fabulous talk on Monday with Will Fabo from OptimizerRX on digital health, a little bit of an overview to the MIT Health Technology Catalyst program, some great folks there, but just showing the different level of evidence, like how much RCTs, how much real-world evidence you need, who you're going to sell it to, who's paying for it, right? If it's direct to consumer, there's a different level of evidence. And maybe, FDA requirements on than something that's prescription, digital therapeutic that's being reimbursed in a traditional, more formulary way. So I could go on, but I'll stop.
Fair enough. So let's ask a question that I guess I guess it helps me clarify a little bit. One, obviously, you make the distinction that it requires a different amount of evidence. Part of it has to do with the fact that you have humans involved in the case of digital health as a broader scenario, if you will. But at what point are you engaged in the practice of whether it's medicine or pharmacy or psychiatry or whatever it is, as opposed to more of a standalone product, which is going to do the work by itself? And the reason I asked that question is because obviously if you don't have the humans involved, you can start talking about AI and when have you gotten into the practice of medicine? And then that has its own implications, if you will.
Well, you can have AI even with humans involved. So you can have coaches that help motivate, but AI to identify, for example, algorithms, triggers, correlations, right? So there's things there. So I will just make that little connection
Thank you.
To say that. But as far as, I think there's different components of when it becomes different things. The question about some of the regulation is all around, is it a medical device? And the FDA has some clear guidance. Those who are involved in the regulatory space, know there's some very clear definitions, and there's also some gray areas. But if you are, if you're making claims about treating depression, for example, that's very much regulated as a medical device. If it's an app that is doing things, so Click Therapeutics and Otsuka Pharmaceuticals have a product CT152 that just kicked off clinical trials in the past month or two. And that is a product that they hope to indicate for depression, right? MDD, major depressive disorder, right? That's a very much medical device, right? You know exactly it has an indication. There are other things that, you know, improve some piece of something, improve some symptoms. And you know, that's a very, like, improved fatigue, right, is very different than saying you reverse the symptoms of, let's just say, rheumatoid arthritis, right? And what the claims would be for what, you know, I worked on Enbrel, so I'm partial to that product. But, you know, what Enbrel can claim, right, based on the evidence they have. And that's obviously pharma, not medical device, but just that type of example.
So is it fair to say that digital therapeutics are have probably a little bit more evidence, but for the most part, they are the equivalent of digital supplements to the drug world. So supplements, the amount of evidence that's required.
I wouldn't say that.
No, okay, tell me why.
I wouldn't say so. So supplements are less regulated. Supplements don't have the same level of evidence. They're over the counter. So I actually don't think supplements. If we're talking about companion to meds, we can get there in a second. But most of these, I don't recall now, you know, some of the leaders in the space talk about how if you put a fabulous magic napkin over, and I said it improves, let's just say, you know, improves HAM-D score or an ACR20 score, so, you know, something that's the traditional way it's measured in any other product, you shouldn't have to ask, is it a drug? Is it a medical device? Is it a digital therapeutic? It's just that it does that. Right, and therefore should be, you know, approved in that way and reimbursed in that way, right? So it shouldn't be thought of it in that way, if that makes sense.
So I guess the distinction is the amount of evidence you already have that suggests that it works, and that's the distinction we're drawing, if you will.
Yeah, well,
so the mysticism around it should be less so, if that's fair.
So what's funny is a lot of this, for example, digital care solutions that have gone the path of, you know, improving symptoms have actually tremendous amounts of evidence. The question is, are they RCTs? Is it real world evidence? How is it generated? The volume, because some of these, for example, direct consumer over the counter type programs have millions of lives that have taken, and they have, you know, because it's data, it's easy to collect outcomes. In my own company, we administer PROs, patient-reported outcomes, right, to track it at baseline and, you know, different periods, so you can say how people improve and sustain their outcomes over time. So very, very similar to other, you know, real-world evidence types of things. But I wouldn't say there's some tremendous evidence of the companies who are going over the counter as their way to market right now. You know, there's some that have like hundreds of studies. There's people, I mean, you know, some things like Noom, which is over the counter in digital health, is approved with the diabetes prevention program, right? They have great, robust data in diabetes. They also have tremendous data in weight loss because they've had so many people come through. And so they can also say with their healthy weight, their healthy mind programs, right? I'm just using that as an example. And that's over the counter, right? Currently over the counter. So those are the types of things. So I would kind of distinguish in different ways.
I appreciate that, because I think it's important to draw that distinction to people who are listening in. So let's ask the question that goes along with that, which is, you have all this evidence, and you, as you pointed out, it's coming from millions of lives. Do you see the future being more real world evidence as opposed to focusing on RCTs? And is that a lesson that, say, we, in the case of drugs, potentially need to consider our real world evidence more than we have been in the past?
So when the real world evidence stuff changed a few years ago, there certainly was it certainly had dramatic uptake. I believe there'll be a need for both going forward. There are pros and cons to RCTs and real world evidence. So absolutely being clear, there's benefits of both. You can imagine, for example, in real world evidence, that if you only save this awesome drug for your sickest patients, just using that as an example, you're going to have more AEs. It's not that the drug has more AEs, it's that you save it as the last resort for people, let's just say oncology, right? You'll have worse progression-free survival, overall survival numbers, because you saved it for your worst patient. Right? So that's, as an example, where RCTs are actually nice. You can control for so many things, control for comorbidities. The piece I would say is, like, RCTs are going to change. That's what we've seen. They've changed in the past year. But also, for example, digital twins, right? Or basket trial design. There's a lot of things that are happening in a different way. And that's obviously has nothing to do with digital health, products, digital therapeutics products, just even traditional pharma drugs, right? How it's going about the process. Because why do we need to subject somebody to control when we have data on all of that for so many people, right? And can't we just take some digital twins and figure it out. And there's some experts that's not my area of expertise, but there are some people who are doing great work on that. And in the past year have been really showcasing that work.
I'm a little familiar with it because I worked at a company that did a little bit of work around digital twins, but do you want to tell people what a digital twin is before we, I believe me, I want to get into basket trials because this is the first time I'm actually hearing the term. So I want to hear a little bit more about that.
So digital twins are when you find identical people in the data and use them in order to, say what their outcomes would be, like what their progression over time would be, what their AEs would be. And you can actually find, oftentimes you'll find more than a twin. You'll find 5 people who look seemingly just like Melinda, my education, my background, my level of exercise, my BMI, my comorbidities, whatever. And you actually can use that data instead of having a control for me to say, if I didn't take the intervention, how did these 5 people do? It's probably a good idea of how I would have, the difference between how I would have done. And so that's so the twinning type of way. The basket studies, which were kicked off and especially prevalent in oncology a few years ago, was more of an all-comers strategy. So because of the way oncology works and you need to catch people instantly and figure out they can't be on other products first, is if they fail to be in one inclusion criteria, they get bumped into like, okay, so they don't have that genetic marker. Well, there's another part of the study that we can move them into. And so it actually reduces dramatically the size of the study and the time to recruit, because that's usually, finding the patients. If you don't get them in the first 2 weeks, they may have gotten introduced on a therapy. Now it's too late to get them in a clinical trial. So there's really, the R&D side of the house, I work in commercial. I love commercial. But the R&D side of the house, for those of you, when we did a quick intro at the beginning, I'm an engineer. I spent about half my career in R&D. So I'm total a nerd on the R&D side as well. But I also love marketing. So.
We're going to get into marketing in about 3 minutes. But my question is, how are bucket studies different from adaptive studies? Or is that the same thing?
It's different.
It's different, okay.
Yeah. But it's probably too
many details to get into right now.
Yeah, probably not for this audience. Google it.
I appreciate it.
Lots of information.
Google it. There you go. Okay, so let's ask a different question. So now you've come in as a CCO for Miami, and you're basically helping them get their ducks in a row, hopefully getting out to a nice valuation, going IPO, all that good stuff. Here's my question for you. How do you even start? And I don't mean specifically about Miami. I mean, in general, you've got an entrepreneur. You're trying to decide whether you want to take the job. What are the questions you ask? What kind of structure are you looking for? And how do you begin organizing them?
So I have to say the great work on the beginning for a company like Miami actually happened years ago, right? Just using that as an example. But it's figuring out, first off, the product and the user experience, right? You have to have a great product that people will use, that they will adhere to, right? And so there's a whole bunch of that. I laugh because I oftentimes talk to people and they want to launch right into clinical trials. And my guess is you need to iterate on your product. Well, I was going to say 6 times, but probably like 17 dozen times by the time you actually need to get to something that you put into an RCT. And so it's interesting. So, get it into the hands of users, figure out how it works, make tweaks. How can you simplify the process? How can you make it sticky, right? So people actually use it. How do you make it easy? So there's some pieces around that. There's also some pieces around the competitive landscape, what differentiates your product. Then there's the whole thing about evidence, right? What evidence do you have? Even if it's, real world evidence, like, my own company, for example, we have a tremendous NPS score, right? So I use that, often show that results happen quickly, right? That people actually see improvements in outcomes at a quick period of time. People also want to know that people use and sustain. So if you can say people have been on your, 80% of people who start your program complete it, for example, those are the kinds of numbers. So when you start thinking about what you may need to do, that is, what evidence you need to generate to get there. The one piece I always say, is like, who's going to pay for this? Is this a business? What's your goals? We had a conversation, I mentioned the MIT program earlier, but we had a conversation with one of the teams. And one of the questions is it a business or is it academic? Like, if your goal is simply to help, perhaps you go about it in a different way. If you're trying to turn it into a business, okay, are you going to be licensing it to someone? What differentiates you? Could this fit into other people's platforms? Do you need to be exclusive? There's a lot of questions that come up. What other companies who are currently doing something similar could easily pivot by adding a module into their platform, right? And so you could work on it for years, and they could, with their all this money everybody's getting, could spend a few $1 million and quickly take all of your hard work, right? What kinds of, since we have an attorney here, what kind of patents you can get, how can you protect the IP? Some of the digital stuff has been harder to protect than the traditional molecules, right? And so what differentiates? So, there's a lot of things to sit down and discuss, but like, I'm an engineer, so my brain always works with like what problem you're trying to solve, and is digital the best way to achieve it? Because so common, people just jump into like, we should build an app. And I'm like, well, first off, is app the right solution? Like, would paper work? I've given this example before in other things, but I always say, like, if you want to reach truckers, you get billboards, right? Like, there's a way to do it. Billboards maybe aren't the best way to recruit people for clinical trials, but figure out what makes sense and then do it. And then the piece about, if you build it, they will come. That is not true, right? People spend, especially in the direct to consumer world, the best app doesn't always win. One that spends a lot on advertising, one that got social media buzz, a celebrity liked it, right? There's all these other factors that come in. And so, that's why people go after the self-insured employers, because you reduce burden of like costs, like your employer gives it to you for free if you have diabetes, right? Yeah. And they promote it and put it out. And you don't have to have great recognition because your employer gave you this free, great program for diabetes. And so maybe you'll use it.
So what I'm hearing you say is, first off, figure out your goals and figure out what you're trying to do. I guess the problem is, at least when you're starting out, you don't really know what your goals are. You're sort of going, I just want to make it big.
They're going to shift. They're going to shift. You think you want to do something, and then you're going to discover.
Right. So in your role, or when you're advising a startup trying to get bigger, how do you sort of tell them, do you tell them get your goals really clean and narrow, or do you say keep them broad, because you will keep shifting your priorities as you keep
you have to have clear, focused goals, right? They may shift from there, right? But if your goal, I always talk about how like Miami's goal is improving, improving outcomes, right? But it's enabling those with autoimmune disease to reclaim their health, right? But it's outcomes. As a side benefit, we also do other things like save money, right? So we save money. But the goal is to help as many people as possible. Part of doing that is to get funding. Part of that is to grow the business, right? Because then you can, get to the point. I oftentimes give the example of how drug companies have amazing patient assistance programs, right? So the way that you can give it away for free is by getting other people to pay for this awesome thing that has great value, right? So that's how you make it accessible to a huge portion of the population, right? Is if you get it reimbursed and coverage, right? Covered is a great way to do it. And so making a great product, a product people want to pay for, is a great way to make it accessible to other people. And so, is that your goal, right? I know on Shark Tank type things, they oftentimes rewarded the people who were philanthropic as a supplement to, we go make money, and because of that, we can give away money, right? And some of the most generous people I know are people who had money to spare, which is why they could give it away, right? And so, I always loved that on Shark Tank when they would ask those questions of people, because I was like, nope, go make money, and then you can give away free shoes or a free sock, but you have to first sell 50 shoes to give away free shoes, right?
So what I guess what I'm thinking about then is, okay, so you've now got your goals figured out. How do you figure out what the appropriate KPIs are to start tracking? Because again, I always find myself in my own entrepreneurial roles to be struggling with, wouldn't it be cool to track all these things?
Yeah.
Is there
less is more? Less is more, right? So 1 million KPIs will drive you to do the wrong things. And also, just an example of a KPI that oftentimes rewards the wrong behavior. So people oftentimes want to track how often people use an app, right? Or how much time they spend on it. But my goal is actually to make it as quick and easy for people as possible. Right? My goal with Miami is you spend less than 3 minutes a day tracking what you do. Like, I don't want you to spend an hour, right, recording things. I want it to be easy because I want you to actually do it. I want to make it work. And also, once you've identified your triggers and changed your behavior, I hope you don't have to use it anymore. Right? I hope that you don't have to record your food that you take for the rest of your life, right? And so I want you to change your behavior. And so I've seen that with KPIs. And when I worked at AstraZeneca, I had some push on KPIs. Like, we should really measure how many people are daily using it. I'm like, oh, for God's sake, a year later, if someone's using our app every day, we've failed, right? Like they haven't learned anything. They haven't made the behavior change. There are certainly some aspects of it. And, Miami has some programs that can go on for a year where we actually do provide, people have life stressors, there's events, there's seasonal things that happen. Like there's certainly reasons to engage more often, but you can engage a couple times a month, not every day, right? As a way. And that's what's sustainable. And that's, with weight loss programs, whatever, you hope that you're not weighing your food for the rest of your life.
It reminds me a little bit of the dating apps. I think it was eHarmony or Match or someone who came in and said, it's the app that gets you off using apps.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm hearing you say, which
so
to me.
Yeah, I think it's Hinged, if I recall correctly, and it says it's the one, I'm totally not on dating apps, but it's the one intended to be deleted, right?
Correct.
And it's like, that's a perfect way to do it, is that you actually, you identify the challenges, you change your behavior, and you get well, and you don't need to use it anymore.
So when you're trying to get funding, how do you convince someone who wants to fund you, no, my goal is they don't use the app? I have to imagine that's difficult.
Yeah, but that's not the story, right? It's, most of the companies have a certain period of time, a 3-month program, a year-long program. Some are using indefinitely. But if I just use musculoskeletal to take something that's not my disease area, is musculoskeletal, like, yes, there's certain PT and you should be doing stretching down the road. But once you, for example, improved, your back, and let's say it's a year-long program someone has. Yeah. You don't want them like 20 years later to still have to be doing daily exercises, right? But also a year of it, which avoids a surgery. It's easy to put out. You can charge a price point that compensates for the fact that you've done that, right? So I think there's pieces of it. I think the bigger thing in fundraising is oftentimes the value of B2B partnerships is oftentimes higher than direct to consumer, and so they're seen more. So if you look at different funding that's happened recently, some companies that have, perhaps a deal with a pharma company, so a digital health company that has a deal with a pharma company, or one that has it with several self-insured employers, like not several, like 100 self-insured employers, gets much better valuations on smaller sales, right? Because there, it's not about the renewing with the consumer, it's renewing with the B2B customer that, they have turnover in their members, they have turnover in their employees, and as new people come in, those people are then offered your program, right? And so that's where your new flow of cash. Miami just renewed. When we kicked off, we were talking about contracts and legal stuff, and so we just renewed a payer partner that we've worked with. This is the third year with them, and that also is great because you demonstrate success, that it was a value that they kept renewing, right? This is a wonderful thing to do. But then as you do that, you grow, their membership grows, it's being offered to a larger and larger population as you demonstrate. And so investors obviously like that as well. Yeah. And so I think there's different components.
So one of the things I really want to get into, and I'm trying to be careful of time, but one last question, I guess. What you talked about, and I loved how you said that, where you said, that's not the story. The story is a different story. And I think the beauty in the end, we as humans respond to stories. We respond to, and when you explained it, you were perfect when you kind of went, it's while I want to help patients, my buyer is the employer. So them showing renewals is the valuation that I need to demonstrate. The patients coming on, to me, it's good if they don't come on. So how do you help people craft their story? How do you help them sort of figure out how you craft that message?
So first off, practice, right? So many people, you need to deliver the message in different ways. The one thing I would say in general in life is being concise is critical and keeping it simple. This is true, biotech investing, digital health investing. If you can keep it simple, I was successful in pharma in getting funding because you have to know the WIFM of whomever you're speaking to at the time, and keeping it simple and I give the example, if you're presenting to a therapeutic area leadership team, and it's, very, very diverse group, medical, clinical, commercial, like all kinds of people, regulatory, legal, all in the room, you have to look at each person and say, for you, marketing, this will differentiate your product. For you, medical, this will reduce adverse events. For you, whatever, you go around the room, and if you have that very, very simple message, including the message that, you're right, maybe one of these 10 things I don't do, but but I'm probably going to hit at least 7 of them, and therefore it's going to be of value, right? So maybe in this, for example, with employers, some of the story is usually about how it improves work productivity, but it also could be about how it differentiates you as an employer in being innovative. I just put together a proposal, which hopefully will go well, for an employer who's really trying to demonstrate, improve outcomes, reduce costs, but also demonstrate that they're adopting some of these innovative programs as employee benefits, right? To show that it improves recruitment and retention of employees, which is totally not even healthcare related, right? Yeah. And it's like, oh, and by the way, we expect that it will improve outcomes, reduce costs, and improve work productivity. They're like, yep. But if I can demonstrate I'm more innovative in a competitive work environment with the type of workers I'm trying to get, right? Those are our key points too. But I can't underestimate. I had a fabulous, when I worked at AstraZeneca, I worked in a pharmaceutical development group, and a lot of phenomenal PhDs, very technical. And how many times I just had to say, like, it needs to be more concise. It needs to be simpler. Like an elevator pitch, which is totally the marketer in me, is the more you can keep it simple for people to understand, no jargon, tell some brief stories, people can take a parallel. Even like when you said supplements, and I immediately said, no, it's not a supplement, right? But if it was a supplement, that'd be a great thing to compare it to. If it isn't, if you want to say, oh, it's similar to how Livongo works, and it's similar to how, and of course, doing a comparison to, of course, a company that had a great valuation is always convenient. but those types of things, if you can really explain it in that way, and that's where I've seen people not get it right in the past.
Okay, so we're gonna have to bring you back, and we'll have a whole conversation on just telling the story. Just want to get a quick sort of recap. We spoke a lot about digital health. We spoke about partnerships. We spoke about the rise in real-world evidence being sort of the basis on which a lot of either approvals or non-approvals are made so that the product can enter the market. We talked about the different types of digital health, whether it's remote monitoring, digital care. We talked about the payers, so we talked about self-employed, self-insured employers. We talked about the distinction between FDA versus practice of medicine. We talked about basket trials and digital twins, and I have to admit, I went down a totally different path with digital twins, so I'm really glad you explained. I was thinking more completely IT-based digital twins, and that's a whole different discussion. We talked about some of the really interesting companies that are in the space. So we're talking about everything from Kaya, Click, Pair, that are great comparators to look at for digital therapeutics. And then you mentioned the Digital Therapeutics Alliance. We then got into digital care. We talked about telling a story, the value of a B2B partnership. There's several more notes that I have on here that we simply can't get into, but did I miss anything important?
The only other one I thought about was that the Exits and Outcomes, Brian Dolan's reports are a great way to get information. So it's a subscription, but well worth it, in my opinion, well worth it. A lot of the others in digital health. I don't get paid for that. I'm just commenting that I oftentimes use it. And so I would say it's helpful to look at.
Perfect. And quick question for you, Melinda. What question would you like to ask the audience if they're listening to answer for us? Put you on the spot a little bit.
What are we in digital health not thinking about that we need to focus on, right? Some of you are not in digital health. Some of you are learning. What are we missing? What are we not, user experience, understand the HCP. I mean, so many components that could be there. Tech, who doesn't understand pharma? Pharma doesn't understand tech, right? Small, big. Yeah. Are there stuff we're missing that you have insights on that we should be thinking about? And all of us are trying to continue and grow. So we're happy to learn, we're happy to take the best nuggets. So I'd love to hear what the audience has to say about that.
That sounds awesome. I also want to confirm nothing in this podcast should be construed as legal or clinical advice of any kind, or even marketing advice. If you want marketing advice, actually call Melinda and see if she can help you. It's intended for educational and entertainment purposes only. For those of you who missed it, where can they reach you?
I'm on LinkedIn, Melinda Decker, Miami CCO. There's all kinds of ways to get to me. So just send me a note on LinkedIn. It would be great to connect.
Perfect. If you like this podcast, please leave a comment. Please subscribe. You can find me at Darshan Talks on Twitter, or just go to our website at darshantalks.com. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Melinda.
Thank you.